the possession and personal use of all drugs, they established a new milestone on the long road toward ending the drug war. Those of you who are members of Global Exchange know that our opposition to the drug war is rooted in the profound human rights disasters that it's provoked in Colombia, Mexico, and elsewhere. We've also witnessed the steep toll that prohibitionist drug policy has taken at home in terms of death and mass incarceration. And that's what we'll be focusing on today. The Oregon decriminalization measure, which takes effect next week, represents a sea change in popular opinion that is not isolated to Oregon. A strong majority of voters reflected the growing consensus that drug use is a public health concern, not one of criminality. Today's panelists are all leaders in the push for better and more effective drug policies that focus on care, not punishment and confinement. We will talk with a California state senator, a leader of the Oregon campaign for Prop 110, and two California champions of drug policy reform about how we can put California on the pioneering path of Oregon and countries like Portugal, where addiction rates and drug-related deaths have dropped dramatically in the years following the implementation of similar decriminalization and treatment measures. Please join me in welcoming Senator Scott Wiener, who represents me and a lot of other people here in San Francisco and northern San Mateo County in the California State Senate. As senator, he's focused on housing, transportation, political reform, clean energy, and alleviating poverty. And he has become known as a leader in the area of civil rights and criminal justice reform, especially as it regards ending the drug war and other root causes of mass incarceration. Senator Wiener, I had a conversation with you in 2016 when you were campaigning at the West Portal Muni Station.
Oh.
It's good to see you again, and it's been good to have you representing us for these last 4 years. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please also welcome Jeanette Zani-Patin. She's the California State Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. She brings skills as a lawyer and advocate to lead the nation's foremost drug policy reform coalition in our largest state. Jeanette has long been involved in the nitty-gritty of the fight for civil and human rights, previously serving as a legislative staff attorney of the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, MALDEF. Janet, it's great to see you again. Thank you again for joining us today. Sammy Aloy is a political campaigner and currently the coalition director of the Oregon Health Justice Recovery Alliance. She's from Portland, Oregon, and she served, importantly, as the deputy campaign manager of the Yes on Measure 110, Oregon's historic drug decriminalization, harm reduction, and recovery services act that just passed last November. Sammy has an impressive track record as an organizer. Before joining Yes on Measure 110, she worked as a researcher and organizer at the Western State Center to combat the rise of white nationalism. Sammy, we'll have to have a whole other conversation about that. She also served as the Oregon field director at Forward Together, working to pass inclusive paid family and medical leave. And as the deputy state director of the Oregon served as the deputy state director of the Oregon Working Families Party. Thank you again so much for joining us today. Armando Gudino is the California policy manager at the Drug Policy Alliance's Los Angeles office, where he focuses on Latino outreach strategies and legislation. Armando is a lifelong champion of human rights and has seen the devastating impact of the drug war up close during a career as a journalist in Mexico, South America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Los Angeles. Armando is a recognized thought leader who's been instrumental in California's drug policy evolution. Armando, it's a real honor to co-host this event with you. We all have teachers in life, and Armando, you're the person who took the time to patiently convince me that while drug decriminalization sounds radical at first, it is actually a common sense, evidence-based, public health-friendly approach that can save lives. I'm handing the baton over to you. Let's get this conversation started.
Fantastic. Ted, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to Global Exchange, a wonderful organization who for quite some time has helped our communities lead the way and bringing about change. And thank you to all our guests who have joined us today on this wonderful day and this important conversation. Again, you're tuned in to this important discussion. Should California follow Oregon's lead to decriminalize drugs and fund treatment? And we're going to get started off the bat. We're going to go to you, Senator Scott Wiener. Senator Wiener, you have been in the forefront of some of these issues for quite some time. And, you know, this is something that we are looking forward to continued leadership and direction. Over the last 5-10 years, Senator, we've seen a significant shift in attitudes and opinions around drugs, drug use, drug sales. In short, the US drug war has slowly but surely been shifting away from prosecuting low-level offenders to more of a treatment model. So my first question to you, Senator, is having been in this space for some time now, what has actually, in your view, been motivating this shift at the national and state level?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I thank you, Global Exchange, and thank you to Drug Policy Alliance. Actually, Drug Policy Alliance is sponsoring 2 bills that I'm authoring this year to legalize safe consumption sites and to finally put an end to mandatory prison sentences for drug possession. So thank you for working with us on these important bills. You know, I think we're seeing over time, it's been a gradual shift in public opinion that I think has accelerated, that people more and more deeply understand that the war on drugs has been an abysmal failure. People see the amount that we spend on prisons because of 50 plus years, almost 100 now, frankly, in terms of when it started, of treating addiction as a criminal issue, not as a health issue. And people see that it actually hasn't done anything. And when people sometimes have questions, and I say to them, okay, for a long time, we've just sort of locked people up because they possess drugs or they've been selling small amounts of drugs or whatever. We've locked them up and put them away for a long time. How's that going? Like, is there less drug use now? Is there less addiction? Are the drug dealers gone? Is it all evaporated because we did such a good job building prisons and wasting all that money? And people say, no. If anything, it's worse now than it's been because of, you know, opioids and OxyContin and the resurgence of meth and everything else, which is, you know, not about who you're locking up. It's about, you know, a health issue that we need to confront. So I think people increasingly understand that, and we're increasingly seeing even, you know, even Republicans, even some conservative Republicans, who are saying, you know what, this is a waste of taxpayer dollars. You can much more cost effectively treat people than incarcerate them. And so we're seeing it, you know, even, you know, someone as horrific as Donald Trump, who after he signed the law that Congress passed last year, which made some changes to drug sentencing, and he ran a Super Bowl ad with it. Right, that wouldn't have happened 10 or 20 years ago by a Democrat, let alone a right-wing Republican. And we see that, you know, or the Koch brothers or Newt Gingrich. It's really, you know, that just shows the shift, that this is an issue that is pervading, and more people understand it. But I will say that despite the shift, and the fact is, in California, as you know, and this is similar to Oregon, we've done some great work in the legislature, but some of the really big changes have happened at the ballot, whether it's a Prop 47 or a, you know, reforming 3 strikes, and the voters, not always, but fairly consistently go against mass incarceration. We still have very difficult politics, I think, like in the legislature, and I assume the same is true in Congress, where even though we know where the voters are, there's still a hesitancy among some Democrats to go what they perceive to be too far out on a limb. And I think drug decriminalization is part of that, and that's why it might ultimately have to go to the ballot.
Excellent. And Senator, you know, so what I'm hearing you say is that, look, the war on drugs, or this drug war, has been in play for roughly 40 plus years. We've spent over $1 trillion. And since its inception, drug manufacturing, production, distribution, use, all of these indicators have gone up. And as you said, we are looking at a policy both at the national, international, and local level that has failed. But there are some efforts, some of your efforts, in fact, that have succeeded. Tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've done at the state legislative level to help address and mitigate the direct and collateral consequences of this drug war.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, we have been, first of all, trying to push for much more of a treatment approach to drugs. That's why we are bound and determined, working as a team, to pass the legalization of safe consumption sites, so that we can, help people who are using drugs and perhaps doing it on our streets and maybe even injecting on our streets, and which is unhealthy for them, unhealthy for the surrounding community. Getting people inside in a supervised context where they can, make sure to have, clean needles and have access to resources, hopefully get into recovery at some point, get help if they overdose, and so forth. We're trying to legalize contingency management for meth so that we can use a proven, and we have legislation on that this year, contingency management using financial incentives to help people who use meth go into recovery, get sober, and stay sober. We were able 2 years ago, working with Drug Policy Alliance and others, to pass legislation to repeal the most common sentence enhancement in California, Senate Bill 136, the 1-year enhancement if you have more than one felony conviction, which had a lot of impacts on people who were using or selling drugs. And we were able to get that signed into law. And then, of course, this year we're trying to end the mandatory jail sentences or prison sentences for people who commit certain nonviolent drug offenses. So we've made some progress. We have some more to go, but I feel like we're heading in the right direction.
And Senator, one of the challenges that these types of conversations, issues, legislative efforts has brought to the forefront is this delicate intersection of, drugs, culture, spiritual beliefs, religion even. And with that, this idea of drug exceptionalism, that under some circumstances, there are some substances that perhaps may require some additional consideration, according to some, while in other areas, and for transparency, as somebody who does work for Drug Policy Alliance, we believe that, we should be looking at this in the broadest of strokes and looking at the broader picture, so to speak, in terms of mitigating the impact that drug arrest has on everybody. Drug exceptionalism, Senator Wiener, tell us about the challenge that is giving that type of preferential treatment to the concept of one good drug over a bad drug.
Yeah, and I think it's complicated. I mean, I think I'm very aligned with Drug Policy Alliance. We should decriminalize drug possession in general, decriminalize drugs in general, because it doesn't serve any purpose to incarcerate people, to criminalize people for possessing drugs. And it doesn't matter if it's a drug, whether it's a drug that has, say, medicinal benefits or a drug that has no medicinal benefits. And it doesn't matter. We shouldn't be criminalizing people, period, end of story. And that is why it is my significant hope, as it is yours, to move towards broad decriminalization of drug use and possession in the state of California. But there are times when it doesn't all move forward together, and obviously the broad decriminalization, that is that's a movement decision about whether we pursue it in the legislature or go to the ballot. when that will happen and how it will happen. I look forward to working with DPA and others on that and being part of that effort. But we know that cannabis was decades, 25, almost 25 years ago now, the voters legalized medical cannabis, and then in 2016 legalized adult use of cannabis, and so cannabis sort of went off on its own ahead of other drugs, and the genesis of that movement was, frankly, it started in San Francisco, Oakland too, but more San Francisco than Oakland. My friends in Oakland like to argue with me about that. Back, especially in the 1980s, around HIV, medical cannabis was saving people's lives, and so it's because of that movement that we got that momentum for cannabis ahead of other drugs, not because it was more worthy or less worthy, or the people using were more or less worthy, but for those peculiar, unique reasons. We now having a similar conversation around psychedelics, and I know in Oregon there was the broad decriminalization ballot measure, and at the same time there was a psychedelic specific decriminalization measure that were both on the ballot simultaneously. As I've announced previously and spoken extensively with DPA about, we're working on legislation to decriminalize psychedelics in California, and then to move towards a model, because it's good to have people be guided when they're using psychedelics about who's going to do that and making sure those people are qualified. And so I know, and we're not pursuing that because, obviously psychedelics have significant medical benefits as well. We're not doing that because psychedelics are somehow more worthy than other drugs or the people who use them, but because there is a lot of momentum that's specific to psychedelics. But I think in the end we want to decriminalize everything, and I'm all for that. I look forward to it.
Excellent. And you know what? That's a great segue. Stay with us, Senator Wiener. As we do go back and explore a little bit further on Oregon, as we've all mentioned a little bit about the significant policy shift that Oregon is currently undergoing. You are tuned in to globalexchange.org. Should California follow Oregon's lead to decriminalize drugs and fund treatment? You're tuned in. You can tune into this on Zoom, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and I'm pretty sure that there's a messenger pigeon running around with messages as well. Let me transition over to Sammy Aloy, Deputy Campaign Manager for Oregon's groundbreaking Yes on Measure 110, which decriminalizes drugs and establishes drug addiction treatment and recovery programs. And Sammy, for those of us that have worked in this space, those of us that are familiar with the country of Portugal and the approach that they've taken of removing drug use, petty drug sales from the criminal justice system and looking at it through a public health lens, for some of us, we look at what you've done in Oregon and we think, wow, is this that model? So let's start with that. Sammy, tell us a little bit about what exactly was Measure 110. What does it do? And by the way, congratulations, Sammy.
Hi, Armando. Thanks so much for having me. The host turned off my video, so if someone wants to turn me back
let's get Sammy back online, please. But as they do that, go ahead, Sammy, and just walk us through, just while they do turn you back on, Sammy, I do want to share this one very brief note. I actually had somebody approach me and actually send me this comment saying, oh, good going DPA, good going Oregon. You're now going to allow heroin users to run amok and buy heroin. And, at the moment I realized, wow, this is just how far removed we are from what this really is. And that's what's part of what's prompted me to ask you that, because I think we need to make very clear what exactly is Measure 110.
That's a great question. Thanks so much, Armando and DPA, for having me in Global Exchange. I'm so happy to be with you all and having this important conversation. I'm going to There we go. Hi. So, first off, the Drug Addiction Treatment and Recovery Act, which is the new law that's gone into effect, formerly known as Measure 110, does not legalize any drugs. So there won't be recreational dispensaries like we've seen with cannabis, but it does, decriminalize possession of drugs for personal use, and shift money from Oregon's statewide cannabis revenue to critical life-saving services for treatment, recovery, harm reduction, and housing for people who use drugs. This is so important because we came into this, Oregon advocates together with Drug Policy Alliance knew that we wanted to do a criminal justice reform measure and decriminalize these offenses because, the system is rife with racial disparities in Oregon as it is across the nation. People of color face disparities at every stage. Drugs are nationally, the biggest excuse that law enforcement uses to stop and harass people of color. And we knew that the war on drugs has failed, and it's not an effective approach, as the senator mentioned. But as we engaged with stakeholders and voters across the state, we heard a broad appeal from Oregonians that this sort of Portuguese model of treating drugs as a health approach instead of a criminal justice system approach was so appealing, because we know that everyone is impacted by the addiction crisis. People have friends and family members and loved ones, or people who are using themselves. Oregon is 49th or 50th consistently in the nation in terms of access to services for people who want to get into recovery. And we know that queer communities and communities of color are disproportionately impacted by those barriers to access. So people didn't know where to turn if it wasn't to law enforcement. How do I get my loved one access to healthcare services with dignity for people who use drugs? And so we knew that we also wanted to make a robust investment in these treatment, harm reduction, and recovery and support services. So Measure 110 really does two things. It converts possession of drugs for personal use from a misdemeanor. And, in Oregon, we had laid the groundwork for this in 2017 by moving those offenses from felonies to misdemeanors. But depending on your prior offenses, you might still have been charged with a felony. And we know that communities that have historically been over-policed for drug offenses were being disproportionately punished with cruel and harsh consequences for these offenses. Taking those misdemeanors and sometimes felonies and converting them to a civil violation, much more similar to a traffic citation. So starting on Monday, when the decriminalization provisions of the law go into effect in Oregon, people will be cited with a $100 ticket that they can get waived by accessing a healthcare screening on a 24/7 telephone hotline that will connect them to the appropriate services in their community. And it's, these are voluntary services. Unlike the current criminal justice system approach, people are not getting mandated by the court system to treatment and having, onerous fees and a high risk of failure and high penalty for failure that go along with that criminal justice system pipeline into treatment. We know that not everybody uses drugs. Not everyone that uses drugs needs treatment. So we're connecting people with a wide range of the appropriate human services that folks need in order to access health and recovery if they need it.
And Sammy, I'm glad you said that, because I think that's one of the it's always one of the big elephants in the room when having a conversation about drugs, right? The fact of the matter is that not everybody that consumes alcohol gets drunk or is a problematic drinker. Not everybody who, consumes recreational products does so to the point in which it becomes a problem. That to say that, like it or not, we do live in a society where there is consumption. There is overconsumption, and there is, yes, unfortunately, problematic consumption. So, my question to you, Sammy, is while that may make sense to some of us in this space, what was the opposition in Oregon, considering its position relative to making services available, the fact that, you are bringing forward a public health model, really expanding, building, developing a public health approach? What was the opposition saying in Oregon about this measure?
That's a great question, Armando. And of course, we did see some of the sort of usual suspects that oppose drug policy reform, conservative members of law enforcement and, members of sort of conservative communities that sort of engage in fear mongering about people that use drugs. But that actually was not the bulk of our opposition. A lot of the pushback came from people who have a vested interest in the sort of current model of connecting people to treatment and recovery services. People sort of are confused and afraid because we've had the drug war for 50 plus years. And right now, one of the main ways that people get connected to treatment and recovery services is through community corrections and through the criminal justice system. And that is not working for people. Most people who have criminal justice system involvement never get treatment or rehabilitation services. People who are connected to treatment through the drug court system, as I mentioned, that's not the best intervention for a lot of people. And, criminal records saddle people with lifelong barriers to housing and employment, immigration status, et cetera. So we knew that system wasn't working, but a lot of folks in the treatment community sort of either believe that recovery means total abstinence. They're worried about harm reduction services and what they mean for the treatment community. And people have contracts with community corrections and with the Department of Corrections, and they sort of believe that people have to be mandated into treatment through a carceral approach. And so, we have to do a lot of policy and cultural change and investing, robust public funding in alternatives to incarceration to make these treatment, recovery, and harm reduction services accessible to people who want to self-refer or to, who want to come in voluntarily and access these services. So, that's sort of the work that we're doing as we're working on implementing the new law is leading lawmakers and advocates from, other folks in the treatment space through, how this can work for people to be able to have access to these services that they otherwise didn't know how they would access.
Sammy, you bring up an excellent point. I think the idea, the concept of coercive treatment, do this or, this idea that you have to bring down the hammer on folks, and something we can revisit with Senator Wiener in a minute around coercive treatment. Of course, we have drug courts and some of these zero tolerance policies where if you don't do this or if you relapse, out you go. What are the messaging? What is the messaging that has resonated? I guess my question is, you were successful in Oregon, right? Voters came through. Was it a common sense approach to understanding this? Was it, folks are just simply tired of this incarceration model? And I find it fascinating that you bring up the fact that, it was the existing system who was really comfortable and cozy, perhaps even benefiting financially, that perhaps gave you some of the most opposition. But as we prepare to go into California and bring in my colleague Janet Zani-Patin, what was the messaging that most resonated with folks in Oregon?
Well, the messages that resonated with voters overwhelmingly across the state were about access to treatment and recovery services. I think people across socioeconomic lines and across communities across the state really did not know where to turn to access affordable, culturally competent, trauma-informed care. And they were on long waiting lists, sometimes 6 to 8 weeks or longer for a treatment bed, which of course we know doesn't work for people who are in crisis. And when they're ready for treatment, they need a quick, warm handoff into those services. And so, people across the state, across political backgrounds, found it very appealing to make these services accessible to families, whether or not they had criminal justice system involvement. And thinking about treating addiction as the disease that it is, and using a healthcare approach to get people access to services before it escalates to the level of criminal justice system involvement was really appealing to voters. And of course, we saw voters in progressive districts also resonated with the message about racial disparities. We got a racial and ethnic impact statement from the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission that Measure 110 was estimated to nearly eliminate racial disparities in drug possession, arrests, and convictions. So we know that this law will really have a transformational impact on racial disparities for personal possession, and that message, resonates with Democrats and voters in urban areas, but overall, across bipartisan and demographic, people really resonated with the feeling that, they need to get these services for their loved ones.
Excellent. Sammy, stay with us. And thank you. And again, congratulations. Monday, next Monday, what is it, February 1st, is it, or 2nd? Okay. You guys are going to be taking that next big step. Congratulations as the implementation begins. And with that, let me bring it back a little bit further south to California. And with us is Jeanette Zani-Patin, State Director for Drug Policy Alliance. And, Jeanette, we have the good Senator Scott Wiener, who has for some time now been a partner in this struggle, helping lead the way towards more progressive, out-of-the-box thinking, bipartisan thinking, national shift on drug policy, and taking a more public health-centered approach. And Oregon has provided the example that it is, in fact, doable here in the States. And now, as Ted pointed out at the beginning of this cast, that California is potentially poised to go next. So I bring it to you, Jeanette, where are we with the Golden State and the possibility of all drug decriminalization?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to thank our host tonight, Global Exchange, for hosting this really important and salient conversation. And I'm really honored to be here as well with Senator Scott Wiener and Sammy Alloy. All the work that has been done in Oregon has been sort of like a blueprint that could be taken to any of the other remaining states here in order to really look at all drug decrim as a viable option. Both Senator Scott Wiener and Sammy have addressed issues that, we are definitely looking at and are considering here in California. First thing, I guess one of the most important things to note is, California is definitely a very complicated state politically. As we know, the state has a really progressive state legislature. We have a really progressive governor, but sometimes, things just are unable to happen in Sacramento, and sometimes it's better left off to the voters. And so, Drug Policy Alliance is sort of exploring sort of both options, whether we do some of this work via the legislature, or and whether we do some of the remaining work potentially via our initiative process. We do know that in California, as was mentioned earlier, we have voters that are a little bit ahead of the curve on some of the criminal justice reform measures that we've done as a state. And so given sort of that history, the history with Prop 47 and Prop 64 in particular, it's a viable candidate for taking this, really great lofty idea straight to the voters. And so we're still sort of exploring, where we want to take this, but we definitely are adopting pieces that we learned from Oregon, and as well as looking at how local jurisdictions are addressing some of these issues as well. We know that, movements like Alternatives to Incarceration and Reimagine LA, and movements including defunding the police, have components of all drug decrim peppered through these different policy proposals. And so we're working with different local jurisdictions to really, enhance these policies at the local level, support movements either by advocates or coalitions and organizers on the ground, and then really just try to, address this as a state in terms of supporting those local policies, helping them to bubble up at the state level, and then, adopting policies statewide so that we can make all drug decrim a reality. Go ahead.
And that brings up a great point. And let me just once again remind everybody you're tuned into a special presentation by our host and conveners, Global Exchange, globalexchange.org. Should California follow Oregon's lead to decriminalize drugs and fund treatment? You can listen in on Zoom, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and you can start asking your questions. Questions are coming in. I want to encourage all of you. I'm going to take a little bit of moderator privilege and remind you all that while this conversation does kind of bring in a variety of other issues, a lot of ancillary topics, we are trying to keep this to the issue of decriminalization. And with that, I want to invite back my colleague Ted from Global Exchange to join us and open up this conversation. Senator Jeanette brings up an excellent point that, California, while progressive, in its scope of issues and certainly in its players, it does have a very challenging history on some of these issues, even among our colleagues and some Democrats and other liberals. What is it that we need to do in order to get more of your colleagues in line with what the general public is saying, which includes this idea that, hey, it's time that we start looking at other models?
Yeah, California is it's a very, very diverse state in every way that you can say diverse. I mean, it's diverse racially, it's diverse politically, it is diverse. I mean, the geography is tremendously diverse, and Democrats in San Francisco or Oakland are very different in many ways than Democrats in Orange County. I don't want to overgeneralize. We have some really awesome lefty Democrats in Orange County.
Okay.
But if the state has become more and more blue. We're to the point now where we will, after a special election in a deep Democratic district in a couple months, we will have 31 out of 41 senators will be Democrat. We have about 60 out of 80 assembly members are Democrats. But as we expand our geography and pick up more and more seats in the Central Valley and Inland Empire and Orange County and San Diego County, these are districts that are not San Francisco, and they are often suburban, much more middle of the road districts. And so you have members who are, they're not going to just support, any criminal justice reform proposal that comes along. They'll support some, but not others, and they have difficult politics to contend with. And so, but I will say, with that said, we have Democrats in some of these, Central Valley, Southern California, Inland Empire, moderate districts, who will go out on a limb and vote for some very aggressive criminal justice reform policy. I think it's inspiring. People who they won't vote across the board for everything, but they will pick their battles on some really hard issues and step out on it and create risk for themselves, like safe injection sites, as you know. So we have been able over the years to pass some really aggressive criminal justice reform in California, to end life without parole for juveniles, to repeal that most common sentence enhancement, to end cash bail. Unfortunately, the voters did the wrong thing and overturned that, in my view, and et cetera, et cetera. So we've done some really good things. But there are times when you just hit a wall. I think it's worth exploring moving a broad drug decrim through the legislature. I think it's possible, but I also understand that there might be an advantage to going directly to the voters. And law enforcement is still powerful at the state level in California. And I will just say one of the challenges, it's good in some ways, but challenging in other ways, because our state Senate districts are 1 million people, and assembly districts are 500,000 people. These are big districts. And that means money comes into play more so than it does in smaller districts. And that creates other political complexities.
And, Jeanette, the senator brings up an excellent point, these political complexities. Right now, you are at the forefront, once again, for transparency. I am an employee of Drug Policy Alliance, and Jeanette is actually my boss. But today here, at the request of Global Exchange, who is hosting us, we're engaging in this conversation. And Jeanette, what has been, or what is your experience right now as you begin to navigate forward this issue of all drug decriminalization? What kind of a response are you getting from elected officials across the board, be it state, regional, or local?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there has been a shift, right? So not only have we sort of come across the arc of like this summer of civil unrest, but I think there's definitely has been a shift in terms of, folks really wanting to take some deep dives and looking into some of the racial equity components of part of this conversation, right? Really understanding, really wanting to understand the data and the complexities that we've created, in the United States and in places like California. So we have, a majority of Latino population. We have a pretty small African American population. Yet, our folks are the ones that are predominantly getting arrested for minor drug crimes and being incarcerated, for possession of drugs or sales. And so the inequities that exist are such that folks, really understand, that we really need to do something different. What we're doing, as we said earlier, just isn't working. And when we look at folks who are drug users and folks who need access to treatment, we really need to meet people where they're at. And that's really sort of a core principle that we at Drug Policy advocate for, especially with regards to our harm reduction work, right? Really meeting people where they're at, looking at the whole individual, whole person care, and trying to provide them with those wraparound services to make some significant inroads and really take this population out of the criminal justice system and really center them within the public health arena. And that's really the work that we did in Oregon. And so, pieces of what we did in Oregon can definitely be replicated here in California. And we just have spoken to, politicians at the local level and at the state level. And there's just this general excitement and, willing to roll up their sleeves and work with us. And so I think the dynamics have shifted significantly.
Excellent. And your work with Global Exchange transcends California, transcends the nation. I mean, your work has gone global. And what's our audience saying? What's our audience asking? What's your read on this issue? Is drug decriminalization something that this country and our community is ready for?
Yeah, well, Armando, as I mentioned at the beginning, you've been, you've really helped me to see the light on this issue, and I think people are more and more ready to take this step. I think that the The idea is frightening to people, especially people who've lived through 50 years of the drug war. And, you know, even if we haven't believed the hype, it's all seeped into us somehow. And we are afraid, and we're afraid to take these kind of measures that now we really see are tremendously beneficial. So, you know, we're seeing a lot of questions come in, comments and questions come in from folks who have been in the audience. You know, one that I thought was really pertinent was that it says Prop 110 was very well written. Voters clearly understood what they were voting on, and what they were voting for. I think that's incredibly important. Another comment from a friend in Washington came in here. Treatment First Washington is working on decrim as well. Is this measure similar to Oregon 110? It seems that the political climate in California is ready to be the next state to decriminalize. What kind of time frame are we looking at? That's an interesting question, one that we might want to address.
And that is a great question. And before we do, Jeanette, in terms of a time frame, you know, Sammy, going back to you, Ted brings up an excellent question about how well written this was. Another one of our questions coming in from Robert, you know, he asked perhaps one of the most important questions that, for the business community, and that was, what was the messaging that was shared with, if any different, from what you've already shared with us, to the business interests, right? This is an issue that comes up often when we talk about legislation at the intersection of drugs, right? There's this concern, there's fear, this misunderstanding, this misinformation that somehow this might impact the business community. Was this an issue with you guys, Sammy, in Oregon?
That's a great question. And, you know, I would say that I think there is a lot of concern from the business community because of the way the houselessness crisis has impacted our cities. But, you know, I think that many business leaders in Oregon recognize that the previous approach has failed, and that by connecting people to services and by taking more of a law enforcement assisted diversion approach to connecting people with services and mobile harm reduction sites and other things like that, that people on the streets could, you know, better access support and stability. And of course, our measure also funds wraparound services like housing, low barrier housing, and employment and reentry services for folks. So, you know, I think the business leaders supported that because they can see that the current approach is not working. And some folks in the business community and in organized labor have seen the way that the workforce has been impacted by the addiction crisis. And, you know, some people, you know, we worked with our electricians union here, IBEW, that, you know, had set aside a fund for members to access treatment and recovery services. And so, you know, these are things that our social safety net should be doing. And so by funding those services, it alleviates pressure on people to sort of have an individualized approach to this systemic problem.
And if I could I just piggyback on that briefly? Yeah, I know we're short on time. I think that last one was incredibly important, because I know a lot of times when people think of addiction and the way it's framed, it's about what's happening on our streets, and it's about people who are perhaps homeless or marginally housed. And of course, that's incredibly important, and some of our most, you know, marginalized individuals who need an awful lot of help, including around, you know, drug use, but well beyond that. But so much of addiction, of course, is about people who are not homeless, who are housed, who have jobs, but who are at risk of ultimately spiraling to become homeless, to lose their jobs, to lose their families. And that's why it's so important for us to be intervening early. And so some of the work we've been doing in California has been around insurance coverage, because, and we passed a major law last year around mental health parity to make sure that, because a lot of times insurance companies will take the position, we will cover you for mental health, substance use disorder when you're in crisis. Once you're already in crisis, it's like saying we won't cover you for cancer until you're stage 4. Stage 1 is too early. Come back and see us when you're stage 4. We would never tolerate that. And so we want to get to people early while they still have a job, while they still have their family, while they still have their housing. And we're following up with more legislation this year. We're working closely with organized labor on it, with the mental health advocacy community. And I just want to really point that out. I'm so thrilled that you guys worked with IBW and other unions on that, because everyone's impacted.
Excellent. And as we begin to wind down in the last few minutes, Jeanette, I want to go back to you one more time here. You know, I'm looking through some of the comments. We have, you know, Carol saying, hey, Savannah, Georgia's here. New Jersey is here. Somebody else said, and we're looking to, you know, follow your guide, follow your direction. It sounds like California is certainly on that path. Is there a time frame that we should be looking at as we prepare to wind down? And I'll go one more round with you, Senator, and Sammy, as we prepare to wrap up for the last few minutes. But Jeanette, take us into that time frame so that we know what to be looking for in the next couple of years, or maybe even sooner. Let's what's going on?
Wow, a lot of pressure. So I think for 2021, as I mentioned, we were looking at some type of legislation. And I think we're in California, at least, I think we decided to work on building the infrastructure in California. You know, one of my biggest concerns, so my background is also as an immigration attorney. And so collateral consequences of the war on drugs on non-citizens has been wide and rampant and pretty awful, right? And so really, you know, from my perspective, really building the infrastructure in California to ensure that all of our population here, regardless of immigration status, is going to have access to treatment. And so how do we do that? I think we are really looking at building the infrastructure in California, getting us ready for all drug decrim, given the complexities of our population and the complexities of, you know, the needs that are out there. And so we have been doing some of that work, and we are going to be doing that work in 2021. We operate on a 2-year initiative cycle in California. So, you know, potentially we could go up for an initiative in 2022, 2024. And so that's sort of the time frame that we're looking at. But in the interim, we're going to be building and working on the infrastructure to make all drug decrim not only a reality, but accessible for all of our communities.
Excellent. Great. And as we wind down the last couple of minutes, Sammy, let's go with a 30-second wrap up. What final message do you have for our audience?
Well, we're very excited that we passed Measure 110 in Oregon by a 17-point margin, but our work is not over. We're still working with lawmakers and constituents to make sure that this law is implemented in a way that invests in communities that have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs, and is implemented fully and without delay. And people can definitely support the Health Justice Recovery Alliance in our work to help make that happen.
Excellent. And Senator Scott Wiener, San Francisco, give us a 30-second wrap up on what is the final takeaway from this important conversation, which we barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, we need to decriminalize and make sure that the services are there for people. And that is something that we struggle with. We struggle with it even in San Francisco, where we, you know, provide a fair amount of funding. And so many people still, they just can't access the treatment. So we have to build that out at the same time we're decriminalizing. It's horrific that, you know, the Los Angeles County jails are the largest mental health provider in the United States of America. We need to end that, but then we have to have other provision of mental health services to compensate for that.
Excellent. Thank you all. Ted, I'm going to toss it back to you. On behalf of my colleagues at Drug Policy Alliance, myself, I want to personally thank all of our guests, and you, Ted, especially, and Global Exchange for hosting us, giving me this opportunity to stand on my own little soapbox today. And I look forward to engaging all of you in the coming months and years as we move this effort forward. And Ted, take us home.
You're muted.
You're on mute. The
Thanks
proverbial.
thanks for being part of this soapbox today, Armando. And I just want to thank all of you, Senator Wiener, Sammy, Jeanette. This has been great. I hope we can, you know, build from here and take this movement forward. You all are inspirations to me. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thanks. It's been
Thank
a
you.
pleasure.